To my talk, do the Loco-MotionLayout. So I'm guessing as Android developers, everyone's been paying attention to Android Dev Summit. So this is now classed as a deep dive because they announced the motion editor with Android Studio 4.0. So a lot of the code you're going to see is all the XML that motion editor will generate for you. But it's still really worthwhile knowing. And from the small amount of playing that I've done with the motion editor, it is a little bit glitchy, so you might want to hold off. So who here has used MotionLayout before? Cool. Anyone used it for anything fancy, anything crazy? Yeah, cool. So the stuff that I'm going to show you, well, now is not irrelevant. It's more aimed at, like, we're going to build an animation and learn about it as we go. You're not going to see every single thing here that MotionLayout can do because, to be honest, I think it can be quite overwhelming. So we're going to start out with simple steps, and then, yeah, we'll see how we go. So in the bottom left-hand corner, you'll see a little bit of text there. That's going to link to the layouts and the activities in the GitHub repo that I have. And then, so you can come back later and you can rewatch this if you feel like you want to and follow along. Okay, let's get going because we got a lot to do. So this is the animation we're going to be trying to recreate, or as close as I could get. I saw it on Dribble, thought it was pretty crazy, and it'd be great to put MotionLayout for its paces. But what is MotionLayout? MotionLayout is a subclass of constraint layout. So if you're familiar with constraint layout, you're probably going to be familiar with the MotionLayout code. It has a min SDK of 14, so it goes pretty far back. I tried to think of the best way to describe MotionLayout, but I think Nicholas Roard, co-creator of MotionLayout, probably describes it best. He says that MotionLayout is a mix between the property animation framework, layout transitions with transition manager, and coordinator layout. So MotionLayout is really powerful. It's great for user interaction and animating, and it's also fully declarative, meaning we can describe it in XML, but you don't have to anymore. So let's start by focusing on the animation where the no longer human book cover rotates and moves down the screen, and just ignore everything else. So what we need first is a book cover, so let's just put that in a constraint layout for now. So in our layout, we just set up all the constraints, and just to put the book cover slightly more towards the top, just off the center of the screen. And if you've seen constraint layout before, this should all be recognizable. And this is what it looks like. All pretty simple so far, right? But it's not going to animate, and that's where we need MotionLayout. So all we need to do is make sure we update our constraint layout dependency to 2.00 beta 2, or beta 3, based on yesterday. And then we can put, just because MotionLayout is a subclass of constraint layout, it means we can just swap the constraint layout declaration for a MotionLayout one. Simple, right? And if we run it, we'll get a null pointer exception, and that's because we're missing a MotionScene, which is a new concept that I haven't explained to you yet. Let me explain to you what a MotionScene is. So a MotionScene is an XML file that lives in the XML directory in your resources folder. Once we've created our MotionScene file, we need to reference it in our layout using the layout description attribute. This is our MotionScene file. I think of MotionScene sort of like a director. It knows how certain parts of the film are going to play out, how one scene is going to go to the next scene. And you can also describe, well, in MotionLayout, you describe how you want to move from one scene to the next scene using transitions. And the transition can have certain attributes. It has an ID. It can have a start constraint set, like we're setting here, which tells it which constraints to use for the start of the transition. And then it has a constraint set end, which tells you what constraints to use for the end of the transition. There are other attributes you can set on it. For example, you could set an interpolator, but these are the three that we're going to use for now. So we have our transition, but we need something to drive it. And with MotionLayout, we have two options, a swipe handler or a click handler. We're going to look at the swipe handler and come back to the click handler later. The swipe handler has a lot of attributes, so let's go through the things that you'll most likely always be using. Firstly, we have drag direction, which defines the direction of the motion that we'll be tracking. In our case, we're going to be tracking the downward dragging. There's onTouchUp, which defines what should happen when you stop swiping. We're going to use autocomplete, which means the transition is going to go to the start or end respectively. There are a few other options like stop or decelerate, but you're most likely going to be always using this one. We have touch anchor ID, which defines the side of the object that should track your finger. In this case, we're saying the bottom of the book cover should track our swipes. And lastly, we have touch region ID, which we've set to the book cover. This means that the transition is only going to occur when we swipe on the book cover. Prior to this attribute being added to motion layout, the swiping was registered on the whole of the motion layout, rather than on individual views, which could make creating transitions for this pretty tricky. There are a few other attributes that we could use, such as max acceleration or drag scale, but we're going to keep it simple. We've got a lot to do. So here's a quick example of using the swipe handler. We have our book cover, which is our touch anchor, and for the purposes of this example, we're not setting a touch region, so you don't have to swipe on the book cover. We have our touch anchor side, which we've set as the bottom. So when we drag down the screen, the bottom of the book cover moves down, and motion layout will try and keep the distance between the bottom of the book cover and our touch point the same. We use constraint sets to define how we want things to look at the start and end of a transition. You can have intermediary steps, like a middle state, but whatever it is, it's ideally a natural stopping point before moving on to the next state. We're going to focus on just having a start and end state for our first scene, just to keep things simple. This is our start constraint set. A constraint set is a lot like using constraint layout, and there are a few differences worth noting, though. The type for the book cover is not an image view in our layout, like it is in our layout. It's a constraint. This constraint will apply to the book cover we've defined in our layout. Any constraints here will override those in our layout. For example, if in our layout we set the height to 1 dp, and in this constraint we set it to 300 dp, it's going to use the 300 dp. Within the constraint object, we can have a number of sub-elements. Here you can see that we're using the layout and transform sub-elements. There's also property set and motion sub-elements. Layout is for all the attribute used to define how you want your view laid out, so constraints, height and width, margins. Transform is how you want to manipulate your view, such as scale, elevation, or like we're using here, rotation and translation. Property set is for alpha, visibility, and progress, and we'll see this later. And then finally, we have the motion sub-element, which we're not using at all in this, which lets you set things related to the transition, such as a path motion arc, which lets you easily add arc motions, or transition easing, which lets you set an interpolator. The great thing about sub-elements is that you only have to define things in your motion scene that will change. So, as an example, if we weren't changing the book cover dimensions or the way it's constrained, we could just remove the layout sub-element and just leave the transform sub-element. This keeps the motion scene much simpler. Before Constraint Layout Alpha 3, you had to define all attributes on the constraint, regardless if they changed, so the motion scene file could get pretty crazy. So that's our start constraint set. Let's take a look at the end constraint set. In the end constraint set, the only difference is that we're no longer constraining to the top, and we've reduced the width to 150 dp. So let's go take a look. If I can find the mouse. And there we go. Moves down. Great. Now we just need to add in the synopsis card behind the book cover. Nothing crazy here. We just add a material card view to our layout above the book cover with a color and corner radius. And I've set the height and width because you have to, but we won't actually be using them. We're going to be using what's set in our motion scene. These are the start constraint sets for the book synopsis card, and I've omitted the book cover so that we can just see everything. We've set the height and width to 140 dp, and we've given it a vertical bias of 0.35, which places it higher up the screen. We set the rotation X to -55. This is the same rotation value that the book cover ends up at the end of the transition. In the end constraint set, we set the height and width to 300 dp, and we set the vertical bias to 0.3 so that the synopsis card moves slightly up during the transition. And then lastly, we set the rotation to 0 so that it's flat on the screen. Staying in the end constraint set, let's make some adjustments to the book cover. I've added a translation Y so that the book cover overlaps the bottom of the synopsis card. I'm also now constraining the book cover to the top of the synopsis card so that it's all relative to the synopsis card at the end of the transition. The other thing that has changed that you can't see is that I've added elevation to the book cover in the layout. Now you're going to wonder why you can't see a shadow, and that's because I've not set the outline provided for the book cover. If I set the outline provided for the book cover, well, let's just take a look. Yeah, it looks terrible. And that's because the rotation on the x-axis is screwing with the shadows for the elevation. We'll fix this later. So let's take a look at that. There we go. Okay, so we got our fancy animating synopsis card, but what good is a fancy animating synopsis card without synopsis text? I'm not going to show you all the code, but we can just add some text views to our layout and also in the MotionScene. And then we're going to constrain that to the bounds of the synopsis card. Then we're just going to copy everything we did for the synopsis card in our MotionScene and apply that to all the text. And we'll get the exact same effect. And if we run it, it's going to look terrible because it's constrained to the top, bottom, and the start and end. But we can just fix that by setting the width to 300 dp, just like the synopsis card. And it's going to look much better. But we can still improve it. If you look at the original animation, the text fades in part way through the transition, and in ours, it starts immediately. And MotionLayout provides us with something really handy that can help us fix this, and that is keyframes. So normally we use constraint sets to represent final states in our apps. We have a start and end state right now, but you could have steps in between that are resting states. That is, the scene has stopped, so to speak. So, for example, you could go start to middle and then middle to end. But what if we only want to change one small thing during our transition? We don't want to keep building constraint sets to get these small changes, and that's where keyframes come in handy. They provide lightweight intermediary steps that your animation or transition can go through. Keyframes can be applied to position or attribute values, and there are 5 types of keyframes. KeyAttribute works on changing an attribute at a certain time. Think changing the color of a button 50% of the way through from white to red, for example. And you can also set a custom attribute, but we'll see this later. Key position allows you to modify the path a view will take during the transition, and we're going to be exploring this more later. And then key cycle and key time cycle allow us to add some interesting cyclical effects to our animations and transitions. Think of things such as bouncing or shaking, but we're not going to see that today. Key trigger allows you to call a function on a widget at a certain time in the animation. For example, calling hide on a floating action button after a swipe down. So back to our animation. We're going to add a keyframe set to our transition, and within that, we're going to add 2 key attributes that do the exact same thing. One's going to be for the title, and one's going to be for the text. We set the alpha to 0, which means when the animation starts, the text is going to be invisible, and we define our frame position as 70, so 70% of the way through the animation. I decided on this after a lot of tweaking. Hopefully you'll have access to a designer who can tell you these things. So what this equates to is the following. Keep the text invisible until 70% of the way through the transition. When we hit 70%, then start animating the alpha from 0 to 1, so we go from invisible to visible. So let's take a look at that. There you go, fades right at the end and back. Cool. Okay, now we need to make the strange liquidy background in the synopsis card. I'm going to probably skip through this very quickly because there's something else I want to show at the end, so bear with me. they're just 2 animated vector drawables. I created 2 SVGs, and they just repeat, go back and forth, back and forth. If you want to know how they're made, come see me after, ping me on Twitter. But let's take a look at what that looks like added. There we go. Great. So that's the end of creating the first scene in this animation. Let's move on to making the second scene where we go to the detail view for the book. And we're going to leave this part and we're going to leave the first part completely and just take the synopsis card with us and create a whole new layout. And we're going to do this just to break it down, make things easier. Here we've added the book synopsis card to our new layout, and this is going to be the starting point for the next scene. In the animation, the synopsis card becomes the header for the details screen, with the text fading out and the rounded corners of the card becoming square. Going from the card header to the header, going from the card to the header is simple enough. In the start constraint set of our new scene, we just reuse the constraint set for the synopsis card from the first scene. And in our end constraint set, we constrain the synopsis card to the start, end, and top of the parent with match constraints for width and height. And we've also added a constraint dimension ratio of 16:9 just to keep some nice proportions. And then we set the elevation to 8 dp so that we can let text scroll underneath later. We'll see that in a bit. Lastly, we're going to need a new transition and a new way to drive our scene. For the first scene, we were using a swipe handler, and in this one, we're going to be using a click handler. A click handler needs a click action. We're going to be using toggle, which will let us go back and forth between the start and end constraint sets by clicking the synopsis card. And I think 90% of the time, this is what you're going to be using. There are other options, such as transition to start, transition to end, which toggle does under the hood. And toggle's just an easy way to get both. There are others, jump to start and jump to end, which can do what I think you can imagine. But if we wanted to, we could further customize this, for example. We could have a combination of jump to start and transition to end. But toggle is what we need, so let's get back to making our transition. We're also going to need a widget to target that's going to react to our clicks. We're going to be targeting the book synopsis card. There's one new addition to our transition, and that's a duration. Unlike the swipe handler, which is driven by the user's swiping movement, the click handler operates on time. I decided on 1 second, which is probably a little too long, but I'm using it to emphasize this demo. Let's take a look at what we have so far. And it looks pretty good, right? But we forgot about the corners, so let's go fix them. How can we fix them? We can use custom attributes. A custom attribute helps when we might be using a specialized widget, like in our case, a material card view, or maybe even if you create a custom view. Some widgets may have specialized attributes, so it makes sense that we can specify these things ourselves. So not all views have a radius attribute, so that's why we need to specify a custom attribute. Things like rotation apply to a lot of views, so that's why you don't need a custom attribute for it. We can use any attribute as long as there is a getter and setter prefix for it, and the value type is one of the following: a custom integer value, Boolean, float, string, pixel dimension, color value, or I've gone too far. If you set a custom attribute, you must set it in both the start and end constraint set. And if you remember earlier, I mentioned that KeyAttributes can also take a custom attribute. So you can use any that I've just mentioned to change something at a certain time. So in our start constraint set, we can set a custom attribute on the book synopsis card for the radius and set the initial value to 16 dp. Remember, this is going to be used over any that you set in your layout, and I just want to reiterate that because it's tripped me up way too many times. In our end constraint set, we set the radius to 0 dp, and we get the square corners. Let's take a look at scene 2. There we go. Got our nice square corners now, and it moves up to the top. So moving on, let's add the book cover back in and get it animating alongside the synopsis card. As you can see, the book cover animates over the top of the synopsis card, and there is a shadow. So we're going to need to sort that shadow issue that we had earlier. So we can go and steal the constraint sets from scene 1 for our book cover, and then just put them in the start of the scene, in the constraint set start for scene 2. And we can add back in the 4DP elevation to ensure the book cover stays over the top of the synopsis card. And we can also use a custom attribute. We set the outline spot shadow color to transparent, so we get the elevation, but we don't get the shadow. Now I try setting outline ambient shadow color as well, which is responsible for setting the shadow that comes down at about 45 degrees on your screen, but I kept getting an array out of bounds error. Luckily though, you can't really see it, and if you can't really see it, does it matter? No, let's just carry on being productive. This is our end constraint set. We set the book cover outline spot shadow color back to black so that we can see that shadow. And we increase the elevation to 12 dp so that the book cover will sit on top of the header. Let's go take a look at what we got there. And there we go, we have the book cover animating nicely over the top. Next, let's add the text back in for the synopsis card. And if we look at the original animation, we can see the text fades out just after we tap the synopsis card and it moves to the top. So what have we used before that can help us do this animation? KeyAttributes. So we just add in our keyframe set to our transition, just like before, and we target the synopsis title and text. We set the frame position to 10 and set the alpha to 0. This means that the text alpha will start reducing from 1 to 0 from the start of the animation to 10% of the way through. After 10%, it's going to be invisible, so we won't see it anymore. In our start scene, we add the synopsis title and text, and we make sure that we set the elevation. Otherwise, the text is going to disappear as the card's elevation increases. In the end scene, we set the elevation for the synopsis title and text to the same as the synopsis card, so we ensure that we see that text fading. We also need to set the alpha to 0. Why? Because if we don't, after 10% of the way through, the text is actually going to start fading back in, as by not setting the alpha, we'll get the default alpha value, which is 1. Let's take a look at scene 2, part 3. And there we go, we've got the text fading in and out. Next, let's add in all the text in the top right-hand corner, along with the rating stars. Now, in the original animation, all the text and icons are exposed when the synopsis card animates over the top. We're going to do something much simpler, though, and just have it slide in and fade from the right. So let's just start with the slide in. In our layout, we constrain all the items to the end of the book cover and to the end of the parent. This means when the book cover animates over the top of the screen, the items will move inwards from the right. And we'll see this in a minute. And you might be wondering why translation 24, and that's just because the book cover is ever so slightly overlapping the white space at the bottom, and we want to keep all this title and text in line, so that means that we have to translate these two. And we can approach all this text fade in much like we did for the fade out of the synopsis card text earlier. It's just that we're fading in now. In our start constraint set, we set all the items alpha to 0, so they're invisible at the start. Then in our end constraint set that I'm not showing, we're just going to add alpha with a value of 1. We set the frame position to 95, and as we have the initial value set to 0 in our start constraint set, this key attribute ensures that nothing will change until 95% of the way through, at which point we're going to start fading from 0 to 1. Now, if we run this, we'd have an issue. The fluid animation in the bottom right-hand corner is still black, which means we wouldn't be able to see the review quantity text. Now, we can't use MotionLayout to do this, as the image views are contained within a material card view. And the key point here is that MotionLayout can only operate on its direct children. And if anyone can tell me who that is on the right, no one's been able to tell me so far after 3 talks. We might be BFFs. But good thing is that MotionLayout has a transition listener that we can use to listen for the progression and change the color ourselves. It has 4 callbacks: on transition trigger, on transition started, on transition change, and on transition completed. It's a transition tongue twister. But what's also provided is a handy abstract class called transition adapter. So we only have to override the callback that we want to use. In our case, we're going to be using the onTransitionChange function, as we need to know the progress of the animation so that we can animate the new white color in, so we can see the text properly. And then in the onTransitionChange, we're just using the color U2 set alpha component and then port a duff mode atop. I don't really want to go over this too much, but if you want to know more, come see me at the end. But this is going to give us that white. Let's take a look at scene 2, part 4. And there we go. So now onto the favorite bookmark and red buttons. As you can see, the buttons arrive and fade in a staggered fashion. And there's nothing particularly interesting about the 3 buttons in the layout, so I'm not going to show you. It's just 2 fabs and an extended fab from the Material Design Components library chained together using constraints. Nothing crazy here if you've been using constraint layout. So this is our start constraint set. Notice we've set the alpha to 0, much like the detailed text we talked about earlier. It's the same in the end, except that we're going to be setting the alpha to 1, just like the detailed text and the rating stars in the top right. Remember, we have to define the constraints for these buttons in our end constraint set, even if it's only the alpha that's changing. We're going to be following a similar pattern to how we faded the header text using KeyAttributes, except the frame position that this is going to happen is going to increase with each button so that we get them in that staggered fashion. There is a motion stagger as well, but I've opted not to use it. This is simple enough. And let's take a look at scene 2, part 5. There we go. So it looks pretty good, right? But there's definitely a problem. Let's take a look at a slowed down version and just focus on the buttons. Can anyone see an issue compared to the original animation? So let's do it again and turn on a really handy feature of Motion Layout called Debug Paths. So as you can see, the buttons animate in a diagonal fashion, and that's because they're constrained to the book cover. They're not animating straight in from bottom to top. And that's because at the start, they are constrained to that book cover, which is there, and then the book cover moves. How did I see those paths? Well, Motion Layout provides a really useful motion debug attribute, which I set to show path, which does what it says. Really handy for seeing your animations, the views, your movement of your views. There's also show progress, which will give you the progress of the animation, the current state, and also the FPS. Or you can turn on both paths and progress with the attribute show all. So let's get back to fixing the fact that the buttons animate in diagonally and not straight up from their end position. We're going to focus on just the favorite button, as whatever we do for one button is going to apply to all the others. There's a keyframe type that I mentioned earlier that we've not used yet called key position. Key position is going to allow us to modify the path a button takes at a certain time. Now, key position has a lot of attributes, and I don't have time, and I don't want to overwhelm you, so we're not going to go through them all. We're just going to go through what I've used with a little bit of explanation. There are some great Medium posts that I've linked to at the end on the slides that you should go check out if you want to know more about it. Curve fit determines the interpolation curve that applies to the keyframe. We're using linear rather than a default spline, but spline is normally better because it provides a smoother transition. Frame position we've seen before. We're applying ours at 0 as we want to move the button immediately to its end position and at the start of the transition. Now we have %x and key position type. So %x allows us to express our favorite button's position in adaptive terms. We don't have the power of the positioning system that constraint layout gives us in a keyframe. So making them adaptive means that we can more easily adjust to things like orientation or different density of devices. %x is directly affected by the key position type, which reflects a coordinate system. We're using delta relative, which determines its coordinate system by using the start and end of a widget's position. There's also parent relative, which is based on the parent dimensions, which typically would be your phone screen if you're using a full-size layout. And then finally, path relative is its coordinate system is based on the direct line between the start and end position of a widget. But back to what we're using delta relative. We're setting our %x to 1, and that's because we want our buttons to move directly to their index at the start of the transition so that they're in a direct line beneath their end position. If, for example, we were to put this to 2, we'd get something similar to this. And in essence, we've doubled the x distance we normally get to be directly below our end position. So as you can see, the % and key position types open up some powerful tools for creating complex movements during animations and transitions. Back to our key position. Our motion target is the favorite button. And we're applying transition easing, and we're just using a decelerate interpolator provided to us by MotionLayout. So the button slows down towards the end of the transition. Other provided interpolators are linear and accelerate. So now we just go repeat this for the bookmark and red buttons, and we're finished. So as you can see in the paths, all the buttons are moving directly to their index straight away, and then they're moving straight up to their end positions. We're still not done, though, because they're not staggering in. And an easy way to fix that is to just offset our buttons. We can do that by setting the translation Y on all the buttons using the KeyAttributes. And this means that we get 80% of the way through when we get 80% of the way through our animation, the favorite button is going to move down to 24 dp, and then it's going to finally start fading in as it reaches the end state. And then we can just go do this for the other buttons and set a larger translation Y so that we get that staggered effect. So let's take a look at that now. There we go. You see them fading and staggering. Cool. The last thing we need to do is add in the scrollable list below the header. In the layout, the list is just a couple of material card views wrapped with a scroll view, no fancy recycler view. I'm not going to show you that in the layout. The setup in the start constraint set is nothing new, nothing that we haven't seen already. We set the alpha to 0 so that it's not visible, and we constrain it to the bottom of the parent so that it's actually off the phone screen. And then in the end constraint set, we're just going to constrain the bottom of the book cover, constrain the list to the bottom of the book cover so that it's offset slightly, accounting for that the book cover being in the white space. And then we constrain the bottom of the scroll views to the bottom of the parent so that it fills the screen. Finally, we add a key attribute to start fading the list in 50% of the way through so that it's already on screen when it starts fading. So let's take a quick look at what that looks like. There we go. Cool. And that's us pretty much done. Now we need to combine these scenes together by merging both our layouts and combining our motion scenes. We only need 3 constraint sets for the combined scene, with 2 transitions to trigger the transitions between them. We need 1 transition where we swipe down to show the synopsis card, and this transition is going to go from the start to the middle constraint set. And the other transition is where we click the synopsis card and go to the book details screen, and this transition is going to go from the middle constraint set to the end constraint set. So let's go take a look at them. Where's my mouse? And then pull that down. And then we can go a bit more wilder, and we can add more stuff in. So we could add the genre circles and have them go out, and have it all go back, and have them come back in. If I can swipe, there we go. And then we could go a bit crazier and have the books on the side, left and right, and flip them out as well. And then we could go even crazier. Oh, has anyone read that? It's a bit old, isn't it? I don't think that's the synopsis text. Oh, 3 stars. I don't think I'll be reading that. What's this? Oh, he gets around, doesn't he? He gets everywhere. Not about for that. Anyway. Find my mouse. Let's get back to it. Okay. there are lots of other things you can use motion layout for. Here's a few examples. You could use it in your app bar layout, and this view is actually provided in the constraint layout examples on GitHub. So you can just steal that, like I did, and then make some crazy animations in the header. You can make your own backdrop if it doesn't exist, because we were waiting on those things to be made for the material components library, right? Or you can steal the animation from somewhere else and make your own bank. And then flip the cards around. So it can do quite a lot. So what are some of the considerations you should make when using motion layout? Firstly, we have no GUI. Oh, that's a lie, because we do have a GUI now. Yeah, this got announced yesterday, I believe, with Android Studio 4, like I mentioned earlier, and as you can see there. So as I think I have time, I'm going to try something stupid. I'm going to try and do a live demo that I literally did earlier. Should we try it? It could bomb, but let's just do it. It's hilarious. It's my live demo alert. Because what could go wrong, right, with live demos? Nothing can go wrong with live demos. You know, what could go wrong if you do blindfold racing? I mean, I could be trying to do a backflip off a boat. Or, you know, maybe I'm a bit of a dick and I just make fun of my friends. Wait for it. Wait for it. It's worth it. Okay. Right, let's try this out. This could bomb completely. At most, you're going to see some of the stuff that I've shown you already working. I'm going to start with the nicer stuff. I just need to quickly mirror my screen, if I can do that. And I didn't think this through. Display. Display. There we go. Right. Bear with me. Okay. So this is Android Studio 4. Yes. So now you go to your layouts. So these are all the layouts that you've just seen. And then this should work. That's the constraint layout. That's why you don't see it. Ah, here we go. So this is now what it looks like with the GUI. As you can see, that's the motion layout. We have our start constraint set there, and we have our end constraint set, so what it looks like at the end. And then we have our transition. And then we can just play this. And don't let me down. Yeah. And then you can speed it up or slow it down. But the great thing is you can literally see I think it worked for every single example I've done. You've just got to remember to click on the transition so you can see everything. So there you go. Let's go for a bit more complex and see if we can break it, because that's fun. Click on the transition. Yeah, that's not difficult. Let's try this one. As you can see, I'm prepared. I did the thing where speakers do where you adjust your slides at the last minute. There you go. Yeah, see, it works pretty well. Let's try it. Let's look at one of the combined scenes quickly just to make sure. So there you can see this one where we did the start to middle and then middle to end. So you've got the two transitions there. And then you can see that one playing out and then the second one playing out. Ooh, that doesn't look very good. Shh. Maybe I need to submit an issue. Right. Okay, let's try it. Let's try it. This could go so horribly wrong. I reckon it will. Okay, so first thing. This is a simple layout. It's just the book cover and a card view. So what you need to do now, go to this design tab. As you can see, it says constraint layout. We can click on that and we can click convert to motion layout. Please work. Hey, it worked. So what that does under the hood is that's going to create your motion scene for you. And let's go have a look. Bear with me. There we go. So that's what it's just generated. It gives you a transition at the start, which is fine, but it doesn't, there's no swipe or click handler there, and it's set a default duration. So what we can do, if we can adjust all our constraints in here, we can have all that, la 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 la. We can do this, don't let me down. And then if we click here, don't let me down. Or maybe I've got that. Oh, there it is. Yeah, this is going to get a bit squashed. I apologize. So I'm going to get rid of that because I don't need it. I'm going to, make that 0.3 so it's just like the original. And that's in our start. So you can see I'm adjusting the start one there, right? And then I'm going to click to the end. And this is going to be what I want it to look like at the end. And I'm going to drag that down. And then I'm going to change the height to 300 dp. Don't let me down. I saw some glitches earlier, so I'm very worried. And then we should be able to just see it. Or do I need to add a click? Yeah, it should just scroll it. There we go. You can just define that. How much time do I have? Okay, yeah, I was gonna do the whole thing and try and do the whole, but no, there's not enough time. The next motion layout talk, behind the GUI. I don't know, the GUI edition. That's it. No one steal it. Back to the talk. You might get to see this again. No. Okay, considerations. Sorry, 1 second. I put the mirroring on, didn't I? Hooray. Back to where we were. Great. So yeah, GUI now. So you've got no excuse to go and try it. It's still a bit glitchy, maybe. The one thing I did see, if you add a swipe handler, it adds the wrong attribute values in the MotionScene file, which breaks it. So you might have to do some manual tweaking. It's early days, though, right? Recycler view and lists. You're going to need to write some code if you want to do this. There's a talk from, I think it's Jason Pearson from droidcon New York. He went into this a bit, and Nicholas Rouard demoed some stuff at Google I/O, which shows how he made a fake recycler view, but you're going to have to get your hands dirty, basically. It's still in beta, which means that the API is stable now, so updating from 2 to 3 was fine. I didn't have any issues. But things can still break, right? So use your own judgment. If you're going to run that, if you're going to use it in production, you know. Performance, if you get too complex, and I'm talking about super crazy animations with views going everywhere and loads of animated vector drawables, it could get crazy. So this is a video of the most complex layout that I had that's running on a HTC One M7 from 2013. And that's on Lollipop. But this was on the older version of constraint layout. I just want to make that clear because I didn't have a chance to update it because I don't have access to this phone anymore. The FPS hovers around 30. I didn't try and do any optimizations. You've got to remember there's animated vector drawables, loads of views. Maybe a recycler view could help make this better because then you'd only got this one set of views. But on my Pixel 3, everything runs at 60 FPS. It's not really a motion layout thing, but I wanted to note that the fading that I was doing with the shadows only works on 28+, as that's when the ability to change that was added. So hopefully you managed to keep up with me. I know that was a lot to take in, and hopefully you're inspired to go and play with motion layout. I've only just scratched the surface. There is a lot more to it, and there's a lot of depth you can go into. So there's plenty more for you to explore on your own. And I just hope you realize how powerful and useful motion layout is going to be for us. So if you're going to start out, just keep things really simple, like I did with the swiping for the book cover. And that's how I started, and then just built it up over a period of time, every few hours on a Sunday. If you want to implement it in an existing project, it might be easier to take it out and put it in an empty project. Then you can eliminate quite a lot of noise, and then you could just swap it back in. Go read the blog posts that are linked at the end by Nicholas Rouard on Medium. They're great. They've got great detail. Everything's still applicable despite the announcement yesterday. And don't be afraid to ask questions on Twitter using the hashtag MotionLayout. They're really good at getting back to you and answering your questions. Use apply changes. It's not like Instant Run, I promise. I've been using it a lot since it was released, and it's been fine for me. And especially if you're doing it in a simple layout, it's going to make swapping all your layout files and MotionScene so much quicker, like blisteringly quick. And you don't get all the issues. I know everyone turns Instant Run off, but trust me, this should be fine. Famous last words. And lastly, just have fun. I don't know about you, but before my current job, I didn't really get to do anything with animations. So try and find a couple of hours, hit up Dribble, or use your imagination and find something crazy and just go play with it. Thank you. One note, I've not put the link up for the slides because I forgot, because I was doing the motion editor stuff at the end, but I will put that out and I will tweet about it on Twitter, and then you can go grab it. There's links here just in case you want to take photos quickly. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And there's more links. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And then one more link, but that's not so important, that's the extras. Thank you.